You know when you're rushing to catch a flight, running through one of those massive airports, have you ever just stopped for a second and wondered who actually owns this place? I mean, is it the airlines, the government, some giant private company? It seems like a simple question, but believe me, the answer is way more complex than you'd think. All right, let's get into it and unpack the really unique way America runs its airports. So here's what we've got on the agenda. We're going to start with who owns America's airports, then look at the special groups that run them. After that, we'll see how the rest of the world does things, figure out why the US is so different, and then land on what we're calling the American Compromise.
Okay, first things first. Who actually holds the title, the deed, to these enormous, critical pieces of our national infrastructure?
To really get a sense of this, just look at the numbers. The United States has about 5,200 public-use airports. Out of all those, around 4,200 of them are publicly owned. That is just a staggering majority. And that right there, that sets the baseline for everything else we're going to talk about.
So when I say publicly owned, who are we actually talking about? Well, it's almost always a local government. The airport you fly out of, it's probably an asset that belongs to your city, or maybe your county, or even the state. Sometimes they even team up. So you should really think of it less like a federal thing and more like a massive, and I mean massive, local project.
But here's the thing. Running an airport is infinitely more complicated than, say, paving a road. So to handle that complexity, a lot of these local governments have set up a special kind of management structure. It's a really smart way to add a layer of separation and, most importantly, expertise.
And that's where you get something called an airport authority, or a port authority. It's a pretty clever solution. Basically, it's a public corporation, but it operates with some independence from the day-to-day grind of city politics. Its one and only job is to run these incredibly complex facilities and to run them like a real business.
This model has some huge upsides. It helps insulate the airport from political whims, They can hire leaders who actually know the aviation business inside and out. And this is a big one. They can raise their own money for huge construction projects by issuing revenue bonds. That means they're using airport income, not your local tax dollars, to pay for that shiny new terminal.
Okay, so that's the US playbook. Public ownership, often run by a focused authority. But does the rest of the world do it that way? Oh, not at all. Not even close, actually.
And this really lays out the difference perfectly. Here in the US, public ownership is king. But you go abroad, especially to Europe, and full-on privatization is totally normal. We're talking airports being sold off completely to private companies or leased out for like 99 years. It's just a different world.
Which, of course, brings us to the big question, right? If all these other developed countries are totally fine with handing the keys to a private company, why has the US pretty much always said, no thanks?
Let's start digging into the maze of financial, legal, and even political roadblocks that have kept pretty much every major US airport in public hands.
And it's not like nobody's tried. Way back in the late 90s, the FAA actually set up a whole program designed to encourage a few airports to give full privatization a shot. They really wanted to test the waters.
So how'd that go? Well, to put it mildly, it was underwhelming. The program just didn't kickstart this big wave of privatization that some people were expecting. Only a couple of small airports ever went through with it. So you gotta ask, why not?
Well, it turns out there are some massive hurdles. First, the airlines themselves often have these clauses in their contracts that give them essentially veto power over a sale. Wild, right? Second, if a public airport took federal grants for improvements, and trust me, they all have, they'd have to pay all that money back if they sell. And finally, there's super strict federal rules on how an airport can spend its revenue, which just makes it a lot less attractive to a for-profit company.
So if selling off the entire airport is pretty much off the table, what do? Well, that leads us right to this really interesting hybrid model that's become the standard across America.
And this is the key thing to understand. Privatization isn't just an on or off switch. It's actually a whole spectrum, right? From just contracting out a few janitors all the way to a complete sale. And most US airports, they live right smack in the middle of that spectrum.
And get a load of this number. It's absolutely mind-blowing. At some of the biggest airports in the country, it's estimated that up to 90% of the people working there are actually employees of private companies, not the government.
So what does this actually mean for you when you're at the airport? It means that even though a public authority owns the building and the runways, almost every single thing you touch or interact with is run by a private company. The restaurant you eat at,
the shop you buy a magazine from, the company that runs the parking garage, the baggage handlers, the cleaning crews, they're all private businesses.
So at the end of the day, it really comes down to this. U.S. airports have found this unique sweet spot. They keep the asset in public hands for oversight, but they bring in private companies to handle the day-to-day operations, to get that business-like efficiency. It's a public utility run with a private sector mindset.
And that really leaves us with the big question for the future, doesn't it? As airports everywhere are scrambling for more funding and trying to be more efficient, is this uniquely American compromise going to be enough? Or is it just a matter of time before those hurdles start to come down and full privatization finally takes off in the U.S.?